Chapter 4. Bach spent that night in a guest room the size of his parents' home. He almost was afraid to sit on the four-poster bed, with its smooth cotton sheets and down pillows aligned in a symmetrical formation. After gingerly stretching across the brass-framed bed, he fully extended his legs, something he hadn't been able to do in his own mattress since he was 9. How can a mattress be so soft to the touch, yet so firm under my full weight? But rather than sleep, he stared at the ceiling and tried, with limited success, to sort the many thoughts competing for space in his brain. He'd had a wonderful time with Aventil, and he was convinced the young noble's friendliness was genuine. But his mind returned to the incident in Oso Creek. Maybe the wise old women and men of the Royal Council would offer an explanation and dismiss Bach to return to Sola Valley. But could it be something else? Something sinister no one had an answer for. But that was only going to grow worse. Surely Mother, Father, Yata, and little Naji are safe at home. I wish I could know for certain. This should have been the best night's sleep of his life. But Bach wrestled with his pillow, aware that sleep would come hard in the palace. The next morning Bach arrived in the Royal Council chambers early. He squirmed on the cushioned marble bench, trying without success to get comfortable. 20 rows of the ornate benches formed concentric circles in front of a dais at the far end of the room. 9 seats behind heavy oak benches stood on the dais, the middle seat being taller than the others. Portraits of Imarina's past monarchs lined the walls on either side of the seats. Bach held his arms close to his chest, as if he could hide his simple homespun clothes from the few well-dressed nobles scattered in the seats around him. Their perfumes and colognes mingled in his nose with smoke from the oil lamps ringing the council chambers. The only other serving-class people in the room were a handful of palace attendants, who tried to remain invisible as they prepared the chambers for the meeting. Bach would have felt more comfortable among them as they did their work than he would sitting among nobles. A now familiar voice behind his shoulder offered a lifeline. "You made it, Bach! In fact, you beat me here." Aventil sat down beside him in the back row and offered a quick handshake. "I know this is your first Royal Council meeting. I'll explain anything you need to know, from the pomp to the players." 7 women and men in formal robes soon filed into the chambers. Each carried hard-earned wrinkles under their eyes and various degrees of graying or balding hairlines. Bach correctly figured them to be members of the Royal Council. They took their seats on the dais, a thick purple curtain behind them. At precisely the appointed hour, 4 people wearing light gray jackets over finely tailored outfits and matching flat cloth caps strode through the front doors of the chambers. Bach recognized their uniforms as emblems of the House of Magic. At the head of the entourage was a short, stubby woman with white hair and no shortage of creases in her face. The youngest of the sorcerers, a young blond-haired man with a slight beard, not quite as tall as Aventil, and considerably more filled out, threw his hat and gloves into Bach's lap as he walked by. "Take care of this, won't you?" The man didn't make eye contact with Bach and kept moving. But I don't—" Bach's protest cut off as the man continued walking to the front of the room. 3 of the 4 sorcerers took seats at a grand table in front of the center of the dais, between the other emissaries' seats and the benches for the audience. The older woman, obviously the group's leader, took the one of the 2 final vacant seats on the dais, leaving only the middle seat open. One of the guardians retrieved the hat and gloves. Aventil covered a laugh with his hand. "Come on, let's move up to the front." Aventil gestured toward the open row of benches directly behind the petitioner's table. "You'll want to be closer to the discussion, particularly when you are introduced." Bach's hands trembled at the thought. Other observers, most of whom carried bundles of papers or thick leather-bound books, moved to the benches, leaving the front row open. By their plain dress and apparent familiarity with the procedural protocol, Bach guessed they were various royal bureaucrats, officials at the various houses, records keepers, and other agents of the crown. Such staff members likely came from the land-owning class, the middle strata between the noble and serving class. People in the land-owning class had more legal rights than those in Bach's class, but not as many as those in the highest tier. A few well-dressed employees may have been young nobles learning their way in the royal court. Bach followed Aventil onto the empty bench at the front of the room. They took seats immediately behind where the three male sorcerers sat at a table. The bearded, blond young man in their group turned and glared at Bach with flinty blue eyes. "The hired help doesn't know its place these days," he muttered in a voice just loud enough for Bach to hear. Aventil leaned over. "I guess you've encountered Kotarian. Consider this a welcoming gift. Everyone in Ithnel has a story about him. I certainly have a few." "Kotarian? Is he a sorcerer?" Bach furrowed his brow. "He doesn't look much older than me." "Yes, he's an acolyte. The final step before becoming a full member of the House of Magic. They're grooming him for a leadership role, which explains his presence here today. Lucky us who must deal with him." Aventil's eyes rolled to the ceiling. "They call him the House's shining light. Oh, maybe that's just the story he tells. Regardless, Kotarian certainly believes it to be true." He pointed to the white-haired sorcerer sitting on the dais. "Up there, that's emissary Loronian. As the leader of the House of Magic, she serves on the Royal Council." Bach nodded, remembering the previous night's conversation, where Aventil had described Loronian as crafty but ultimately loyal. Aventil then pointed to a square-jawed, gray-templed man at the petitioner's table. "That's Karagian." The man's tapping foot patted a quick drumbeat into the red rug covering the white marble floor. "Karagian is Lenorian's chancellor, or second in command, and the person most likely to take over her leadership of the House of Magic one day. He's even more hard-nosed than Lenorian. He protests every time the king asks the house to do anything. To listen to him, Imarina revolves around Sonorian Square." Aventil put his hand up to cover his whisper. "I'm pretty sure he also wears pads under his jacket and lifts in his boots." Bach couldn't help but smile. So, how were they allowed such insubordination? Don't they have to do what the crown commands? That was the way the world worked in Sola Valley. The serving class may not like it, but the noble class made the decisions, and the king ruled the noble class. Aventil nodded. "Oh, sure. But it isn't quite so simple. Imarina's national defense is based on the power of high magic. Any invading army is going to pay a heavy price before our royal guardians even get their boots muddy, thanks to Imarinian sorcery. The House of Magic is the reason Imarina has been at peace for more than 300 years. But with that kind of power comes haughtiness. The House of Magic needs to believe every good idea is one they thought up. Thankfully, King Isbiano is an expert in that dance." Aventil pointed to the fourth gray-jacketed sorcerer who sat on the same bench as Bach and Aventil, behind Kotarian and Karagian. The balding, bespectacled man fumbled with a stack of papers, while the other two sorcerers ignored him and chatted amongst themselves. "Anyway, our final sorcerer is Salandrian. He's the dean of the House of Magic, meaning he oversees the house's vast repository of information. He's usually holed up in his study at the top of the tower, doing who knows what type of research. Every so often they dust him off and bring him here before the Royal Council whenever there's a technical question on magic. The man knows his spells, but he couldn't care less about politics or power struggles. Leave him alone with his scrolls and books, and he's as content as a fly on honey. As with Loronian and Karagian, gold braids and medals decorated Salandrian's jacket, indicating his position within the House of Magic. Kotarian's jacket was adorned with neither a braid nor a medal, as he was still an acolyte. However, he wore a blue and white starburst pin on the breast of his gray tunic. That must be his House's Shining Light medal. I bet he bought it at the Great Bazaar. Aventil chuckled at his own joke. Well, Bach just nodded. I still don't know where I fit with these high-ranking officials and reality-shaping sorcerers. The only magic I know is folk magic. Nothing compared to the vast arcane knowledge assembled at that table. At least Bach knew this was no longer a prank. People in positions this weighty could only gather for something of actual importance to the kingdom. A thickly muscled royal guardian opened the door in the back of the room and held it open. The assembled crowd stood up. Bach did the same. The most important woman in Imarina, Princess Isabella Inishari, entered the royal council chambers. Bach had no way of knowing it, but she soon would become the most important person in his life, too.